The funeral was supposed to be a farewell. But when Rex, a loyal K9, leaped onto his fallen soldier's casket, something unexplainable happened. A presence, a battle beyond life, and a goodbye that wasn't the end. Watch till the end to witness a story of unbreakable loyalty and the supernatural. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. A farewell wrapped in silence. The air inside the chapel was thick, heavy with grief, heavy with silence. The kind of silence that didn't just sit in the room but pressed down on your chest, made it hard to breathe. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sounds were the faint rustling of fabric as mourners shifted in their seats and the occasional muffled sob that broke through clenched jaws. Rows of uniformed soldiers sat stiffly in formation, their postures rigid with discipline. But their eyes, those eyes betrayed something deeper. A weight they carried, a loss they weren't ready to accept. At the center of it all was Nathan Carter's casket, a polished mahogany box that seemed far too small to contain the man he had been. Draped over it was the American flag, folded with precise corners, a solemn tribute to his sacrifice. The candles flickered against the stained glass windows, casting shifting colors across the floor, hints of blue and red, like veins of fire and ice. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't so utterly devastating. Nathan had survived war, survived explosions, ambushes, the scorching heat of the desert, and the kind of cold that cut through bone. He had made it through things that should have broken him, things that should have killed him. But life had a cruel sense of irony, because now, here he was, silent, still, gone. Sitting in the front pew, gripping a damp tissue between trembling fingers, was Emily Carter, Nathan's younger sister. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, her hands shaking so badly she had to clutch them together. It wasn't fair. Nathan wasn't supposed to be the one in that casket. He was supposed to come home, to call her with that stupid lopsided grin in his voice and say, "Hey, Em, guess what? I made it through another one." But he hadn't. The weight of that reality was suffocating. Yet no one in that room felt the loss more than Rex. At the entrance of the chapel, restrained by the firm grip of a military officer, stood the German shepherd. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. His ears twitched. His deep brown eyes scanned the room, searching, desperate. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it, but he didn't understand. Nathan was missing, and nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Rex had been trained for war, for combat, for danger, but not for grief. Not for the inexplicable absence of the only person he had ever truly belonged to. Then suddenly, he found him. His gaze landed on the casket, and something inside him shifted. Rex froze. His ears perked up. His muscles went taut. And then, before anyone could react, he lunged. The officer holding his leash staggered back, cursing as Rex yanked free, his nails clicking against the polished floor as he sprinted down the aisle. A gasp rippled through the chapel. A few soldiers instinctively moved as if to stop him, but no one actually did. They couldn't. Rex leaped. His body landed with a soft thud on top of the casket, and for a fleeting moment, the flag shifted as if Nathan himself had stirred beneath it. The room collectively held its breath, but Rex didn't care about the flag. He sniffed frantically, his wet nose pressing against the wood, searching, searching, searching. A whimper escaped his throat, a sound so raw, so filled with confusion and sorrow, that it cut deeper than any spoken word ever could. Then slowly, his movements stilled. Rex curled up on top of the casket, his head resting against the smooth surface, as if willing Nathan to wake up, as if refusing to accept that he wouldn't. Emily let out a strangled sob. One of the officers cautiously stepped forward, reaching out for Rex's collar. The dog growled, a deep, low warning sound. Not aggressive, protective, possessive. He wasn't leaving. The room fell back into silence, heavier than before. And then, without warning, the air changed. A strange, almost imperceptible chill crept through the chapel, like a breeze slipping through an open door that hadn't been touched. The candles flickered again, but this time, not from the air conditioning, not from the soft breaths of the mourners. No one spoke. No one moved. And then Rex's ears twitched, his body stiffened, his breathing slowed, his eyes locked onto something or someone in the distance. But there was nothing there, at least not that anyone else could see. Emily felt the hairs on her arms stand up. Rex wasn't just looking, he was tracking. Something was here. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. Rex! But the dog didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even seem to hear her. A shiver ran through the room, passing over the soldiers like a ghost brushing its fingers against their skin. And then the candles flickered. Again. But this time, one of them went out. No wind, no movement, no explanation. Just gone. A hollow silence stretched over the room, heavier than before. And in that moment, Emily knew. Nathan hadn't left. Not completely. And Rex? He knew it too. The presence beyond the veil. The chapel had never felt so cold. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows across the walls. And yet, somehow, the dim glow did little to chase away the unsettling darkness creeping through the room. Rex remained perfectly still atop Nathan's casket, his breathing shallow, his body tense. His deep brown eyes were locked onto something no one else could see. His ears pricked forward, his muscles coiled like a predator tracking unseen prey. Emily's stomach twisted into knots. Something wasn't right. The silence in the room was no longer just about grief. It was something else. Something heavier. A shift. A presence. The soldiers in the pews exchanged uneasy glances. They were men trained for combat, for life and death situations. But this was something beyond their training, beyond their understanding. Sergeant Dwayne Carter, one of Nathan's closest comrades, cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. What is he looking at? No one answered, because no one knew. Then, without warning, Rex let out a soft, breathy whimper. But it wasn't the mournful cry from before. This was different. It was questioning, recognizing. His tail wagged, just barely. A cold chill rushed through Emily's spine as she clutched her arms, rubbing away the goosebumps that had appeared out of nowhere. Rex seized something. She could feel it too. A shift in the air, a strange energy that hadn't been there before. She turned slowly, following Rex's gaze, but there was nothing. Just the altar, the stained glass windows, the flickering candles. Nothing. And yet, her pulse pounded in her ears as she swallowed hard. Rex, she whispered again, but her voice barely made a sound. The dog still didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react to her. Then, the silence shattered. Bang! The chapel doors slammed shut on their own. The sound echoed like a gunshot, sending a ripple of gasps through the room. A few soldiers jumped to their feet, their hands instinctively moving toward their belts, toward the weapons they weren't even carrying today. Emily's breath caught in her throat as her heart hammered against her ribs. It was just the wind. It had to be the wind. But deep down, she knew better. No one had been near those doors. Not a single person had moved. The chaplain, Father Michael Reynolds, gripped his Bible tighter, his fingers turning white. He had officiated hundreds of funerals, stood in countless rooms filled with sorrow. But this was different. Sometimes, he murmured, his voice steady yet laced with something unreadable. Dogs see what we cannot. A shudder passed through the soldiers like a ripple in still water. Rex let out a low huff, his nose twitching, his ears flicking back, like he was listening to something. And then, something impossible happened. The flag on Nathan's casket shifted, just slightly, just enough. Like a breath had moved it, like someone had touched it. Emily's body went rigid. No one had been near it. No wind had stirred in the chapel. And yet, it moved. The soldiers sat frozen in place, their bodies stiff as if they just marched into a battlefield they weren't prepared for. Sergeant Carter exhaled sharply, forcing a breath into his lungs. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. But then, Rex moved, slowly, deliberately. He lifted his head, eyes filled with something Emily couldn't quite name. Recognition, relief, and then, in one fluid motion, He sat up, not rigidly, not fearfully, but like a soldier awaiting orders. His ears stood tall, his tail curled loosely around his side. His gaze remained fixed in that same empty space near the altar. And for the first time since Nathan's death, he looked at peace. Emily's throat tightened, because she understood. Nathan was here. Somehow, some way, he had never truly left. And Rex, he could see him, feel him, sense him. Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but before she could even blink them away, the gun salute began. The first shot fired outside the chapel. Boom! The walls seemed to tremble with the force of it. Rex didn't flinch. The second shot fired. Boom! This time something happened. Rex's head tilted slightly, just for a fraction of a second, before his tail gave a single, small wag. Like he was responding to something. To someone. The final shot rang out. Boom! And then, Rex exhaled, a long, slow breath, like the weight of something unseen had finally lifted. Then he did something no one expected. He turned his head, looked at Emily, and nudged her hand, gently, as if saying, "It's okay now." Emily let out a breath she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she believed him. But then, the lights flickered. Just once. Just enough for a shadow to dance across the walls. Just enough for Emily to swear she saw movement in the corner of her eye. Just enough for the soldiers in the room to shift uneasily, their bodies tightening like they were preparing for battle. And when she turned to look at Rex, his eyes were locked on the empty space in front of them again. Not fearful, not confused, just watching. And she knew. Nathan wasn't done yet. Not yet. And whatever was about to happen next was far from over. The unseen battle. The tension in the chapel was suffocating. Emily could feel it. Something beyond grief, beyond sorrow. Something unnatural. The air had thickened, charged with an invisible force that made her skin prickle. Rex remained still, his gaze locked onto something just beyond the reach of human sight. His ears twitched, his body stiffened, not in fear, but in focus. Nathan was here, somehow, some way, but something else was here too, a presence, a force that didn't belong. The soldiers shifted in their seats. Some clenched their fists, others instinctively reached for their hips, where their weapons would have been if this weren't a funeral. Sergeant Dwayne Carter broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Somebody tell me they saw that." No one answered, because they had. The candles had flickered. The flag had shifted. The doors had slammed shut on their own. None of it made sense. Father Michael Reynolds clutched his Bible, his knuckles white. He inhaled sharply before speaking, his voice low and steady. "There are forces in this world we don't always understand." Emily swallowed hard. She wasn't religious, never had been. But right now she wasn't so sure what she believed. Rex suddenly let out a deep, guttural growl. Low, dangerous. His body went rigid, his hackles rising along his spine. His tail didn't wag this time. Emily's heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't right. Whatever Rex had seen before, whatever had made him wag his tail, it was gone, and something else had taken its place. Something that made him go from mourning to guarding. Then, bang! The sound of the final gun salute echoed through the cemetery outside, and all the lights in the chapel went out. A woman in the back gasped. A few soldiers cursed under their breath. The only remaining light came from the flickering candles at the altar, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Rex's growl deepened. Emily's breath hitched. And then, the flag on Nathan's casket shifted again. But this time, it wasn't subtle. This time it lifted, like someone or something had brushed it aside. One of the soldiers gasped. "Jesus Christ," another muttered. Emily took a step back. Then, the entire casket moved. Not a lot, just an inch. Just enough to make the polished wood scrape against the platform. Just enough for everyone to hear it. A cold wave of fear crashed through the room. Emily's throat tightened. No, this can't be happening. Nathan was dead. Dead. So why? Why did it feel like something was fighting to get out? She turned to the chaplain, desperate for an explanation. But even he looked shaken. The soldiers were no longer sitting. They were on their feet, eyes wide, hands shaking, staring at the casket like it might explode. And then Rex lunged, straight at the air in front of the casket, straight at nothing, his teeth bared, his jaws snapping violently, as if he was attacking something they couldn't see. Emily let out a strangled cry. "Rex, stop!" But he didn't stop. His growls turned into full-fledged barking, furious and relentless. His muscles tensed, his paws slamming against the ground. He was fighting something. Something invisible. Something strong. The air in the chapel grew colder. The candles flickered wildly. And then a shadow moved. It was faint, just for a second. A ripple in the air. A distortion in the light. And then a voice. Not out loud. Not something anyone could hear. But something felt. Inside. Deep. Like it was in their heads. "He is mine." Emily gasped, stumbling backward, nearly collapsing. She wasn't the only one. Sergeant Carter's face drained of color. One of the younger soldiers actually dropped to his knees, shaking, because they had all felt it. That voice, that whisper, that thing. And it wasn't Nathan. It was something else. Something wrong. Something that didn't belong in this world. And it was claiming him. Emily's blood turned to ice. "No!" Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. "Nathan does not belong to you." The room seemed to tighten, the very air constricting, pressing against her chest like a crushing weight. The candles flickered violently, their flames stretching unnaturally tall. Rex barked louder, more desperate, more furious. And then something slammed into the chapel doors from the outside. Boom! The entire building shook. Emily's hands flew to her ears. The soldiers ducked. The chaplain muttered a frantic prayer under his breath. And then a gust of wind rushed through the chapel, so powerful it nearly knocked Emily over. The candles blew out. The entire room plunged into darkness. A final, deafening growl erupted from Rex. A growl so powerful, so filled with rage, that it didn't sound like it came from just one dog, but from something bigger. Then, everything went still. The air, the room, the very fabric of reality. Emily could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heartbeat. And then, a single candle relit, its flame soft, steady. The chapel doors creaked open, slowly this time, and the pressure in the room lifted. The weight, the suffocating, unbearable weight, was gone. Rex stood panting, his body heaving from exhaustion. His ears twitched. His tail gave a slow, final wag. Then he stepped forward and placed his paw gently on Nathan's casket. Not in fear, not in sorrow, but in victory. Emily gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. Whatever had been here, whatever had tried to claim Nathan, was gone. But the battle wasn't over, not yet, because now it was time for goodbye. And Rex was finally ready to let go. A goodbye that wasn't the end. The chapel stood still. The air, once suffocating with unseen forces, was now lighter, though it carried the weight of something left behind. Whatever presence had tried to claim Nathan was gone. The invisible battle had ended, and the victor still stood. But there was one last battle left to fight, the battle of letting go. Rex remained at Nathan's casket, his paw still resting on the polished wood. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths, no longer tense, no longer on guard, but present. For the first time since this nightmare began, the dog wasn't waiting. He was accepting. Emily wiped at her face, barely able to control the sobs that racked through her. The fear, the panic, the overwhelming sense of something supernatural had left her trembling. But it wasn't just that. It was the realization that Nathan was really, truly gone. And yet, he wasn't. She knew it now. Nathan had been there. His presence had lingered. And whether it had been to fight, to protect, or just to say goodbye, he had been there. And maybe, just maybe, he still was. The chaplain was the first to speak, his voice steady but raw. Sergeant Nathan Carter dedicated his life to service, to his country, and to those he swore to protect. He glanced down at Rex, his expression softening. And even now, that bond remains. A silence settled over the room. Not the kind that felt suffocating, not the kind that carried grief like a noose. This silence was reverent, honoring something greater. One of the officers approached Emily, holding the carefully folded American flag in his white-gloved hands. His voice was firm but gentle. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. Emily reached out, her hands trembling as she took the flag. It felt heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. She clutched it to her chest, holding on as if it were the last piece of her brother she would ever have. Then outside the chapel, the sound of boots striking the pavement echoed. Sharp, precise, disciplined. The honor guard had formed. It was time. The moment no one had been ready for. The moment Nathan was truly laid to rest. The doors creaked open again, this time at the hands of the officers who were carrying the casket. The warm afternoon sunlight streamed into the chapel, cutting through the lingering shadows. Rex hesitated. Emily saw it, the momentary flicker of hesitation in his deep brown eyes, the fear of leaving, the fear of moving forward. She reached down, running her fingers gently through his fur. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's take him home." For the first time since that day, the day Nathan never came back, Rex looked at her, really looked at her, and he moved. The final goodbye. The cemetery was silent. Rows of uniformed soldiers stood at attention, their bodies rigid, their hands locked at their sides. The wind stirred softly through the trees, rustling the grass around the freshly dug grave. Emily stood at the front, gripping the flag against her chest. Rex sat beside her, his gaze locked onto Nathan's casket. It was as if he was still standing guard, still watching over his partner, still waiting. The chaplain spoke again, his voice steady. "Today we lay to rest a hero, a son, a brother, a soldier, but above all a man who loved, who fought, and who never once abandoned his duty." Rex let out a slow breath, his ears twitching as though listening, really listening. And then as the final words were spoken, he did something no one expected. He moved forward, step by step, slow and deliberate. When he reached the casket, he placed his paw on it. Just for a moment, a silent vow, a final promise. And then he stepped back. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, barely holding back her sobs. The soldiers around her, tough, battle-hardened men, weren't so successful. Even Sergeant Carter wiped at his eyes as he muttered, "Damn good dog." And then the gun salute began. The first shot rang out. Rex didn't flinch. The second shot, his ears pricked. The third shot. And then, just as the final echo faded into the air, Rex's tail wagged. Once, software certain, like he had heard something no one else could. Emily sucked in a breath, because she had felt it too. A warmth, a presence, a goodbye, or maybe a promise that somewhere, somehow, Nathan was still there, watching, protecting, and waiting for the day they would meet again. Epilogue, moving forward, never letting go. The funeral ended. The soldiers gave their final salute. People left. But Emily and Rex remained. She knelt beside him, running her fingers gently through his fur. "He's not coming back, boy." Her voice cracked. "I know you don't understand, but—" She stopped herself. Did she even understand? Maybe death wasn't the end. Maybe love, real, unbreakable love, didn't just disappear. Rex let out a slow, deep breath. And for the first time since Nathan's death, his posture changed. No longer tense, no longer waiting, just remembering. Then suddenly, his ears twitched. He lifted his head, his gaze locking onto something beyond the grave, beyond the people, beyond the world they could see. His tail flicked, just once, and then he turned away, no longer looking back. Emily exhaled a shaky breath, wiping at her eyes. Come on, boy, she whispered, standing. Let's go home. And this time, Rex followed, without hesitation, without fear. For the first time since losing Nathan, he was moving forward, but Emily swore, just for a second, she felt it again. That warmth, that presence, that quiet, unseen goodbye. Or maybe it wasn't a goodbye at all. Maybe it was a promise that some bonds never break, that love never truly leaves, that one day, somewhere, somehow, they'd find each other again. And when they did, Nathan would be waiting. Reflection, a story beyond the grave. Some say animals don't understand death, but maybe, just maybe, they understand it better than we do. Do you believe love can reach beyond life? That some souls never truly leave? Share your thoughts, because sometimes the ones we lose are never really gone.